Let me bring in two former CBO directors, Doug Elmendorf and Don Marron. Great to have both of you gentlemen. From what you just heard, and we'll get to the health care draft that's been put out there in just a moment, but this is the breaking news here. Is this good news or bad news for Social Security recipients? Donald?
Sure. So I'll just quickly go first. The projections are that obviously these programs, their trust funds run out of money, 12 to 18 years from now. There are programs that you'd like to put on a sustainable basis sooner rather than later so that people can plan ahead. And so there's a lot of work to be done, but obviously we're not in a political environment that's conducive to that at the moment.
Doug, what did you think?
I agree with Donald. We want to make changes sooner rather than later. Today, we are still phasing in changes in Social Security that were put into law in the early 1980s because it's important to make changes gradually so people can get used to them. We're already overdue for making changes, but the crucial question here will be what kinds of changes we make. Are the changes that we make to put these programs on a long-term sustainable basis cuts in benefits or increases in taxes? And whose benefits and whose taxes?
Well, you just heard Treasury Secretary Mnuchin say that, and this was his quote, the way to add assets, translation money, to Medicare and Social Security would be through tax reform and the growth it will generate, also known as the anticipation that the growth it would generate. Doug, is that dynamic scoring concept ringing your bell or not quite yet?
Well, I think Secretary Mnuchin is right about the concept. Faster economic growth will extend the life of these trust funds, but I don't think that any plausible increase in economic growth would go nearly far enough to extend these programs indefinitely. And you saw the Secretary duck that question. These projections of 3% economic growth per year are absurd projections. We might hit that for a year or two, but to have that sort of growth rate for 5 or 10 years or longer isn't going to happen in this country given our current demographics. If you look back at the 1980s, say, where we had faster economic growth, the baby boomers were strongly in the labor force. Women were moving into the labor force in large numbers. Today, the baby boomers are retiring, and women's labor force participation has essentially peaked. So the labor force is growing about 1% per year more slowly in the next few decades than it has in the past few decades.
Don, before we move on to health,
lower overall economic growth.
Okay, Don, before we move on to health care and how you see the CBO scoring of the latest draft, let me just quickly push back on perhaps what Doug said, and that is there's this great belief that if you cut people's taxes and put more of their money in their own pockets, they will spend more. That'll be better for companies who will then in turn hire. You don't see Stephen Mnuchin's point, or do you?
I think if we do an intelligent tax reform, you can get a little bit of boost to economic growth, similarly with regulatory reforms. But I completely agree with Doug. The notion that we're going to get 3% growth over the next decade is, not literally impossible, but probably, 1 in 10 or less, and not something you should count on, given the aging of the population that's both slowing our rate of economic growth and bringing closer the challenges in Social Security and Medicare.
Now let me get to the health care draft that has just been floated once again, this time, of course, same, by the GOP senators. Doug? Will it score appropriately well, or are you worried about this one still not quite making it and losing a lot of people on off the insurance rolls?
There's no doubt that this revised legislation will still have a huge decline in the number of Americans with health insurance. I'm waiting, like Donald and others, to see what the CBO analysts ultimately say, but the core of this bill is still a big reduction in federal subsidies for health insurance that will make health insurance unaffordable or unavailable to millions of Americans. The changes that are being made may or may not be enough to draw a few more senators into support. I'm not sure of that. But the essence of the bill is the same as it has been, and you'll see that in the CBO estimate.
And we've got to figure out a way to pay for it, Don. Best way, in your opinion?
Well, so the question is to pay for what, right? If you take the health bill at face value, what we see today is actually they're walking back some of the tax cuts they would have done for high-income folks. That no longer is as much a focus of their effort.
Right. They're keeping in the Obamacare era tax cuts for the higher earners.
Right, yes, you're right. So the 3.8% tax on net investment income and a higher payroll tax for Medicare, both are staying in there for high-income folks. That, in principle, gives senators more money to work with to try to build a coalition to enact this. But again, I'm going to agree with Doug that it's hard to see how you make the numbers work without having a very large loss in health insurance coverage.
Doug Elmendorf, Don Marron, both former CBO directors, and we remind people, and gentlemen, you can argue with me or not, the CBO is nonpartisan. You never been pressured by any politicians? Never?
You know, pressured, but it's nonpartisan.
Pressure.
Okay.
I agree with Donald.
Okay, great to see both of you. Thank you so much.